in a kingdom ravaged by famine and plague. A peasant boy is torn from his dying village because his face mirrors a ruler's lost heir. Forced into silks that scratch his skin raw, he becomes a living ghost, an empty vessel to soothe a broken man's grief. In dark corridors and cold chambers, he learns that a familiar face can be a prison, not a blessing. As disease creeps through castle walls and whispers of betrayal fester, the boy clings to scraps of memory, a grave, an orchard, a name no one speaks, while the world decides whether he will vanish like so many before. Under the iron sky of a harsh winter, the boy trudged barefoot through mud and frostbitten roots, his ribs like the branches of the dead orchard around him. His village, once loud with goats bleating and neighbors gossiping over wells, lay quiet. Now plague and hunger had stripped it to whispers and shallow graves. He'd buried his sister himself behind their cottage, too weak to cover her with more than a few frozen clumps of dirt. When the riders came, he didn't run. He didn't even stand. He sat by her grave and watched the hooves crush the garden fence. They called themselves the Lord's men, though the boy knew nothing of lords beyond taxes. No one had silver to pay. When they dismounted, boots thick with fur and steel buckles, they did not look at the dead. They looked at the living, at what scraps of youth could be hauled away and repurposed. The men shouted for children to step forward. He did not think to hide. Hunger had hollowed the will to resist. Cold had killed shame. A gloved hand lifted his chin. The man who touched him wore a chain around his neck, silver links stamped with a lion crest. He peered into the boy's hollow eyes as if reading a ledger. With a grunt, he motioned to a waiting cart, already carrying two other children, both silent as stones. The boy was pushed onto the straw, a tangle of dirty limbs. The cart jolted forward, rattling down the rutted path away from the orchard, away from the cottage that now belonged to crows and wind. At dusk, they stopped before high stone walls. Firelight flickered in arrow slits. A banner hung limp on the gate, a black stag on a field of white. He heard one of the guards whisper that the plague had eaten half the household, even some of the servants who slept close to the kitchens. They needed new hands, new bodies. They needed replacements. He was hauled off the cart and marched through a courtyard, reeking of wet horses and rotten straw. They herded him down a corridor into a hall so vast he thought it must be a church. Candles trembled in iron racks. At the far end, a cluster of robed men murmured beside a high-backed chair, draped in furs. In the chair slouched a figure he could barely see, wrapped in dark velvet, face shadowed but eyes sharp as a hawk's in torchlight. One of the robed men stepped forward. He wore the plain habit of a monk, but around his waist glinted a silver chain like the man who'd lifted the boy's chin in the orchard. The monk did not speak to him, only looked, stepping closer, circling him as if inspecting a piece of meat. The boy's ragged tunic was yanked over his head. He shivered in the stale air, gooseflesh rising along his thin arms. A servant with a basin of warm water appeared. Another man poured a vial of oil over his hair, fingers raking through lice and knots. They scrubbed his skin until it reddened raw. The robed monk motioned again, and the boy felt hands pushing him forward, closer, to the figure in the chair. He forced himself not to look at the staring faces around him, guards in battered mail, scribes clutching inkpots, a pale woman with a gold crucifix who refused to meet his eyes. He lifted his gaze, and the ruler leaned forward. Candlelight revealed a lined face under a crown half buried in fur. The ruler's eyes darted over the boy's cheeks, nose, the curve of his jaw. Somewhere in those eyes flickered something the boy could not name, sorrow, or maybe hope rotted sour by grief. Behind the ruler, a man in a red mantle whispered urgently. The ruler's hand lifted, silencing him. A dry voice cracked the hush. Asterisk, bring him closer. Asterisk. A guard's leather glove pressed into the boy's back, and he stumbled forward until he could smell the ruler's robe's musk, sweat, the sharp bite of old herbs. He felt the ruler's fingers brush his cheek, tracing the line of his brow. The boy flinched, but did not pull away. One of the scribes leaned close to the monk. He heard the word prophecy. He heard saint's sign, divine mercy, rebirth. Each word made no sense, but weighed his shoulders down, all the same. The ruler's cracked lips twitched. Another word passed between them, heir. The monk spoke then, voice thin but steady. He said the child was chosen, that famine and pestilence had been sent as trials, and that mercy now arrived in the shape of this boy, this pale ghost of a lost bloodline. The boy did not understand what a bloodline was. He only knew that the ruler's trembling hand stayed on his cheek, too long, as if pinning him in place. Someone placed a heavy robe over his shoulders, fine velvet but stinking of old perfume. The monk took his hand and pressed it to cold metallan, icon of a saint with eyes wide and unblinking. Words of blessing spilled around him while wax dripped from candles and hissed on the flagstones. They led him away from the hall, deeper into the fortress where no windows cut the stone. He passed by chambers lined with tapestries of battles and crowned men, places his mind could not follow. Down a winding stair, he was pushed through a narrow door into a room no bigger than the goat shed at home. A straw mattress lay in the corner. A basin of water smoked faintly in the cold. A single candle burned on a shelf. Guttering as the guard latched the door, he crawled onto the straw, the robe too large, tangling his knees. For the first time since leaving the orchard, his eyes filled with tears, but they did not fall. He swallowed them like bitter broth, curling on his side, to warm his knees with his breath. He traced the stone floor with a finger, imagining roots, river mud, the grave behind the cottage fence. None of it was real now. He had no name here. When the monk returned at dawn, he would strip him again, wash him again, press more cold relics to his skin, cut his hair to match the dead prince's portrait that hung above the ruler's bed. He would sit at the ruler's feet when summoned. He would smile when told. He would be the ghost they needed. Somewhere beyond the walls, snow fell into the orchard, covering his sister's grave, covering the garden fence splintered by hooves. He tried to picture it, but found only the cold breath of stone. In the fortress, he learned his first lesson. It was not death that erased a boy. It was being kept alive as someone else. At dawn, the boy woke to rough hands, shaking his shoulder. His eyes burned from dreams that slipped away the moment he blinked. A bucket of cold water splashed over his shoulders before he could stand. He gasped, but did not cry out. The monk in the brown robe watched him shiver and pointed to a fresh tunic folded on a stool, plain linen but clean and stiff with soap. The old rags he had come in with were gone, burned, he guessed, like his name. Once dressed, he was marched through narrow halls that smelled of damp straw and stale smoke. The floor was slick with rushes that servants changed only when lice grew thick. A line of other boys moved ahead of him, heads bowed, shoulders drawn tight. Some were older, some younger. None spoke above a whisper. Their bare feet slapped cold stone. A guard prodded them into a low chamber where a single brazier glowed weakly in the center. Here, they learned how to stand, how to sit, how to hold their hands so they looked gentle and pure. An older boy with sunken eyes showed him how to lower his gaze when passing the ruler's guards. When the ruler appeared in the hall above, they were brought out one by one. They knelt beside the chair draped in fur. They poured wine. They picked crumbs from the carpet. Each mistake earned a strike across the back of the neck with a switch that hung from the monk's belt. Afterward, they waited by the walls, still as statues, until the ruler rose and left them behind like furniture. At night, their tasks changed. One boy carried coals to warm the ruler's chamber. Another fanned incense in the chapel to keep evil spirits away. The boy's job was to sit cross-legged on a cushion just inside the ruler's door, silent until dawn, ready to be called forward if the ruler woke. From dreams that made him sweat and cry, the castle was no grand place of feasts and laughter. It smelled of boiled onions and sour wine. The kitchens steamed with rancid fat. Rats prowled the rafters, bold enough to scurry over bare toes in the dark. Food was rationed carefully. The boys ate scraps left on wooden plates, then broth. Stale bread soaked in lard. If the ruler was pleased, sometimes a cooked bone came down to them, stripped clean by dawn. Illness moved quickly here. One boy, no older than 10, coughed through the nights until blood stained his bedding. When he died, 2 servants wrapped him in a moldy blanket and carried him to the pit behind the stables, where dung and ash buried him just deep enough to keep the dogs off. No priest read a blessing. No candle burned for his soul. The boy learned not to ask questions. He learned the names of the guards who liked to shove him against cold walls when no eyes watched. He learned which corner of the courtyard gave him a glimpse of the sky if he stood on tiptoe. He saw women come and go in fine cloaks, their perfumes sweet but cloying, their eyes flicking over him as if he were another goblet on the Lord's table. Once a lady reached out to touch his cheek. Her fingers were soft and cold. She called him by a name that was not his, then turned away, laughing behind her sleeve. At dawn, the monk returned with his tools, a razor, to scrape the boy's scalp. Smooth, a bowl of herb paste that stung his skin raw. They said his hair must match the dead heir's last painting, neat and light enough to catch the candle's glow. When he cried from the stinging cuts, the monk pressed a thumb to his lips, until he fell silent. If he flinched, the monk's stick left welts he could feel when he lay on his straw mattress. Some nights, other boys whispered about what happened to those who tried to run. One told of a boy who slipped from the kitchens and made it as far as the orchard wall. They found him the next day, tied to the cart that brought firewood, his feet black with frost. The ruler's men left him there through the morning for all to see. After that, no one whispered of leaving. They only whispered prayers they did not know how to finish. His days blurred together. He folded cloths, polished brass candle holders, scrubbed floors until his knees cracked. He learned the smell of sickness clinging to old stones. He heard the hiss of boiling water for the ruler's wine baths. He flinched at the slap of boots in the halls, never sure if they came for him. Some nights, when the ruler sat alone, the boy was made to kneel at his feet, while trembling fingers traced the curve of his jaw. The ruler's breath smelled of bitterness and fear, like stale broth gone sour. Sometimes he thought he saw pity in the older concubines, eyesmen who had grown too thin, faces sharp like blades. They taught him to keep still when the ruler raged about harvests and traders and sins that needed penance. They warned him not to look too closely when the ruler's grief turned mean. A word out of place could mean a month in the cell under the chapel, where rats bit through your sleep. No one wanted that cell. No one wanted to hear the monk's soft voice whisper penance through the door. In the courtyard, if he was lucky, he sometimes carried grain to the pigeons. He would stand in the frost, his breath a pale ghost in the dawn, scattering feed in circles, while a guard watched. He thought of the orchard. He thought of the grave behind his cottage, now buried beneath months of snow. He tried to taste the river in his memory, cold water on cracked lips, but when he turned from the pigeons, the castle swallowed him up. Again, at the end of each day, he lay on his straw bed, knees drawn tight to his chest. The older boys told stories of villages before famine, mothers who sang, sisters who braided their hair. They told them not as memories, but as ghosts they could never claim again. In the dark, they practiced silence so thick it swallowed tears before they fell. One dawn, the boy asked the monk what would happen if the ruler found someone else with the same face. The monk paused only long enough to tighten the boy's collar and push him toward the courtyard. He understood then that his face was not a blessing, but a debt. One day the debt would be too costly to keep. Disease came again before the first thaw. A cough in the kitchens spread through the lower halls. A serving girl lost her hair and teeth before she died on the rushes. A guard collapsed at the chapel door. The boys scrubbed the floors with vinegar that burned their skin raw. They rubbed onion and garlic on their tunics, as if these poor tricks could push death away. They watched each other's eyes for fever, for the trembling that meant the pit. Waited. Night. He lay awake, listening to the moans that seeped through the cracks in the stone. He wondered how many more days his bones would hold him upright. How many more dawns he would sit at the ruler's door. A ghost for a ghost, waiting for the soft hiss of the monk's breath, and the cold water that stripped him down to nothing. Again he learned to pray with no words, only a slow breath pressed into straw and darkness. He did not pray for escape anymore. He prayed only to remember his sister's grave behind the orchard wall, the small patch of frozen earth no one would ever bother to erase. The fever arrived like a curse carried on stale air. At first, it took the weakest, the boy who limped from an old wound, the kitchen girl who had never stopped coughing since autumn. But soon the monks whispered that the sickness was an omen, a punishment for hidden sins. Fires burned day and night in the courtyard to smoke out the foul humors. But still, the halls filled with the sharp smell of sweat and vinegar. The ruler's men blamed the servants, then the monks, then the boys themselves. Rumors crept through stone walls, like rats. Someone had offended the saint's relic. Someone had spoken the lost heir's name aloud. Someone had let in the devil, through an unclean thought. He listened as the older boys traded stories in hushed voices. One swore he'd heard the ruler's own chamberlain spitting blood in the chapel. Another claimed the monks were mixing ash into the soup to quiet the fevered moans. None of it mattered. The boy could feel the sickness crawling under his ribs at night. A slow burn that turned his legs to lead when he tried to stand. The ruler, who once pressed his trembling hand to the boy's cheek, no longer called him to sit near the fur-draped chair. The ruler stayed locked behind doors that smelled of boiling wine and scorched herbs. Sometimes, deep at night, the boy heard muffled weeping, a voice crying out the name that wasn't his. But no hand reached for him now. When the door opened, it was only the monk who came, eyes sharper than ever, fingers pinching the boy's chin to study the fever flush on his cheeks. One dawn, the monk made him kneel by the basin. Cold water splashed over his raw scalp as the monk muttered prayers. The boy's knees ached on the stone. He clenched his teeth against the shiver that rattled his bones. The monk spoke of sin lodged in flesh, of devils wearing the skin of saints. If he wanted mercy, he must not speak, not question. He must obey, or the sickness would drag him to the pit behind the stables like all the rest. Outside the chapel, the sick were gathered in rows to be blessed and bled. The boy saw an older concubine dragged out by two guards, mouth slack, eyes glazed like frosted glass. They stripped his fine tunic away and left him shivering on the stones, while the monk pressed a blade to his arm. Blood spilled into a cracked bowl. No one looked away. The boy saw what waited. If the fever won, bones bent over a basin, dignity spilled with the pus and bile. When the monk finished, the concubine was carried away and never came back. The ruler's fear turned cruel. Orders came that no one was to speak without permission. The guards paced the corridors, cudgels tapping at doorframes to remind the boys to stay silent. One evening, the boy heard shouts outside the kitchens too. Boys had fought over a heel of bread. By dawn, they hung side by side in the courtyard, feet bare, tunics stiff with frost. The monk called it a lesson in discipline. Mercy, he said, was for the dead, not the living. The boy's duties grew stranger as the fever spread. The monk made him kneel by the ruler's door through whole nights, whispering prayers he did not understand. If he dozed, cold water snapped him awake. If he shifted, a guard's boot reminded him to hold still. Some nights, he felt the heat behind his eyes like a candle burning from the inside. He pressed his forehead to the flagstones and begged the fever to spare him, to let him keep his mind sharp enough to remember the orchard. His sister's grave, the dirt under his nails from that last day of digging. One night, he was summoned into the ruler's chamber for the first time in weeks. The ruler's eyes were sunken hollows, the once rich robes spotted with spilled wine and herbs. The boy knelt by the bed while the ruler ranted about betrayal, servants plotting poison, monks selling relics to thieves, concubines mocking him behind velvet curtains. The ruler's hand shot out, bony fingers gripping the boy's chin, so hard his teeth knocked together. Through dry lips, the ruler hissed that he had grown wrong, that his face did not match the portrait anymore, that his eyes were too dull, his voice too rough. He was asked if he'd lied, if he'd stolen the dead prince's soul, only to twist it. He did not answer. He had no words. The ruler's slap left a red bloom across his cheek that burned until dawn. After that night, he was stripped of his robe and left in the cold corridor outside the chapel door. The monk told him he would cleanse himself through hunger and silence. For days, he scraped candle wax from the floor to chew when his belly ached too fiercely. When he shivered too hard to stand, he pictured the orchard fence, broken by hooves. The grave behind the cottage? He told himself it was still there. Under snow and roots and the patient hum of spring, the crisis came when the fever touched the ruler himself. The household bristled with dread. The monk ordered candles lit from dusk to dawn. Prayers droned in Latin by lips too cracked to form the words right. Servants scurried with hot coals and sharp herbs, trying to burn the sickness out of the ruler's breath. No one was allowed near except the monk and one trembling boy who held a bowl to catch the ruler's vomit. When the ruler raged, they all trembled. When he slept, they did not dare exhale too loudly for fear of waking him. One morning, the boy was dragged into the ruler's chamber. The ruler pointed at him with a trembling hand, eyes glazed with fever and rage. He shouted that the boy's face had betrayed him, that the ghost he needed had slipped away while he slept. The monk's cold voice agreed that penance was needed. The boy did not struggle when they forced him to his knees by the hearth. Ash drifted down like snow, clinging to his hairless scalp. A cord bit into his wrists as they bound him to the iron post beside the fire. He felt the warmth lick his skin, smelled the burnt oil on the coals. The monk chanted words about cleansing impurity. The ruler muttered about saints and blood and the price of loyalty. The boy's eyes blurred with smoke. He waited for pain to bloom and carry him away. But no fire came, only the hiss of hot iron pressed near enough to blister but not kill. When they dragged him back to the cell under the chapel, he felt the weeping come in fits. He buried his face in his knees so the guards would not see. He bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted iron. Each breath tasted of stone and the faint sweetness of the old incense that clung to his skin. He lay on the straw and wondered if he would wake to another dawn or if the fever would finally curl him into the shape of a ghost for good. But even as his body shook, a single thought flickered stubbornly. He had not screamed when they pressed the iron near. He still had his voice, buried deep in his chest. And if he ever found the orchard again, if the fence still stood, maybe the world would remember him as something other than this shadow wearing another boy's name. He drifted between sleep and waking, tracing the bruises on his wrists, the heat blister on his shoulder. Each mark reminded him that the ruler's grip was not mercy, but fear, and fear could crack, given time. As the fever rattled the halls, and the walls dripped with cold, he waited. His name was gone, his body was frail, but his will, however small, rooted itself like the orchard under snow, unseen but alive, waiting for spring. He woke in darkness that did not feel like night, but something deeper, heavier. The fever had burned itself out, leaving his limbs hollow, his tongue cracked. He heard footsteps above boots scraping stone, a door slamming. Voices drifted down, but they spoke no name he knew. He pressed a hand to the floor, felt the chills seep into his bones like it was calling him down. When the door opened, it was not the monk or a guard, but a kitchen boy with a face he did not know. The boy left a chunk of bread and a clay cup half full of brackish water. He asked no questions, gave no name, only fled when the door thudded shut. He chewed the stale bread slowly, tasting dust and mold. Each swallow scraped his throat raw, but it was life, thin as it was. He sat with his back to the damp wall, listening to the drip of water somewhere deep in the stones. When the monk came again, he brought no prayers or iron. He only unlatched the door and told him to stand. His legs trembled under his own weight. The monk's hand pressed between his shoulders, pushing him forward through narrow corridors that smelled of smoke and rotting straw. No guards flanked them now. The halls were quieter than they had ever been, like the castle itself held its breath, waiting for the fever to choose its next claim. They passed through the courtyard. Ash drifted through the air from piles of burned bedding and broken rushes. Dogs picked at scraps left where the sick had died too quickly to bury properly. He forced himself not to watch the pit by the stable. While, if he did, he would see the concubine's slack face, the kitchen girl's matted hair. The monk hurried him on. At the chapel, he was made to kneel again. The monk's fingers traced a cross on his forehead, smearing ash into the open cut above his brow. He spoke of cleansing, of a place where those too dangerous to bury in the earth were locked away from the living. He did not understand until they led him beyond the chapel door, down another stair so narrow his shoulders scraped stone on both sides. The room at the bottom was nothing but damp air and straw spread across flagstones. A single iron ring was sunk into the wall. They chained his ankle to it and left him with only a cracked bowl of water and the stale scent of candle smoke that never reached him. When the door clanged shut, he closed his eyes and tried to remember how many days had passed since his mother's grave. He could no longer picture her face. He could only feel the dirt under his fingernails the day they buried her beside the orchard. That memory was the last piece of himself that felt real. He drifted between sleep and waking. Once, he thought, he heard the ruler's voice echo down the stair, angry, accusing shadows of treachery and betrayal. But it faded before he could lift his head. The fever returned in small waves, like the body trying to burn itself clean, but failing. Sometimes he woke with the taste of blood on his tongue. Sometimes he pressed his ear to the stones and imagined the orchard roots pushing through to find him, wrapping him in something green and living. Voices above spoke in frightened whispers. He caught scraps of words: succession, writ, of mercy, the saint's relic. He understood none of it, except that he was not the boy they spoke of, not the lost heir, not the ghost the ruler needed. He was only a reminder of something broken. He did not know if the ruler still lived. The monk came once, left him a cup of vinegar water and a crust of bread so hard he had to soak it against his gums until it crumbled. He tried to speak, but his throat closed around the words. The monk left without a backward glance. In that silence, he felt himself thinning like smoke in wind. He dreamed of running, bare feet over frozen earth, the orchard fence splintered beneath his palms. But each time he reached the grave behind the cottage, he woke with straw stuck to his cheek, a rusted chain biting his ankle raw. Days passed, or maybe weeks. He could no longer count. One dawn, footsteps came again. He braced for the monk, for a blow or a prayer he did not want. But it was the kitchen boy again, pale and wide-eyed, a bundle under one arm. He knelt by the boy's chain and pushed a piece of dried meat into his hand. He whispered that the ruler was gone, carried out at dusk, wrapped in so much cloth they could not see his face. Fever or poison, no one would say. There would be no relic, no heir, no ghost to comfort the nobles. The kitchen boy pressed a finger to his lips, then left without waiting for thanks. The dried meat was tough, salted so strong it stung the sores in his mouth. He chewed it slowly, fighting the urge to swallow it all at once. He licked the salt from his fingertips, tasting a scrap of life he had nearly forgotten. He closed his eyes and felt the chain around his ankle as if it were part of his skin now. He wondered if the kitchen boy would come again, or if he, too, would vanish into the castle's cold bones. Above, The castle fell silent in patches. Some days there were voices, angry men arguing about who would hold the keys, who would claim the ruler's title. Other days, nothing but the sigh of wind through the broken shutters. When footsteps did come, they were slower now, careful, as if everyone feared the same ghost that had once been needed so badly. One night, he woke to the smell of smoke, thick enough to choke him. Shouts echoed above fire in the outer halls. He tugged the chain, felt it bite deeper. He pressed his cheek to the stones, coughing through the bitter haze that slipped under the door. He could not tell if it was mercy or another punishment that the flames did not reach him. When the shouts faded, silence crept back in, carrying the charred smell of something final. No one returned for him after that. Days turned to hunger. He sucked water from the cracks where rain found its way down. He pressed his palm to the cold iron ring, tracing it like a grave marker. Sometimes he whispered his sister's name into the stones, just to hear a sound that belonged to him alone. He wondered if anyone would ever unchain his bones when the last breath left him curled on the straw. Long after he stopped counting heartbeats, he knew his name had vanished from every tongue that once spoke it. There would be no record, no line, in the monk's ledger. The orchard would grow wild over the grave behind the cottage, roots pushing deep into the bones no one cared to mark. And somewhere in a cold castle, dust would cover the bed where a ruler once wept for a ghost he could never hold. When the final breath came, it came softly, as if drawn away by the same cold that had always waited for him. He let it go without fear, without a word. In the quiet that remained, he was no concubine, no heir, no shadow of a dead boy. He was only himself, unseen, unrecorded, a life snuffed out like a candle flame in a forgotten cell. And the world outside, burdened by famine and plague, turned its back and went on, never knowing he had ever drawn breath at all.